it's rather interesting, actually, just having had this conversation with the monk this evening, because what we're looking at in Tibet is the overtaking and systematic annihilation of a spiritual culture by an invading foreign force, in that case the Chinese. And that idea that one can take over a whole land and culture and spiritually erase it was in fact the central idea of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. That's what happened there, and in a way, when I look at the whole story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, I see it's a great tragedy, really, what happened. And it makes me, and it's why in the novels that I'm writing about this, I'm trying to look at the spiritual forces at work behind history, and a theme that I constantly come back to, which is the choices between good and evil that we have as human beings, and that we make sometimes on a very large scale that affects the whole world. It so happened that the Spanish had the technology to cross the Atlantic Ocean and encounter what was for them a new world, but what was for the inhabitants of that world a very old world indeed. Imagine how it might have been if things had been different. Supposing the Spanish had gone into that adventure not with a lust for gold or to take over unknown lands, but with a desire to learn and to offer love to others. How much European culture would have benefited from learning from the indigenous culture of the Americas, and how much the indigenous culture of the Americas had to learn and benefit from contact with Europe as well. It could have been a tremendous meeting of minds, and had that encounter taken place in a different spirit, the whole world that we live in today would have been a different place. The era of colonialism would never have taken place. The slaughter of the Native American peoples, the systematic genocide of Native American peoples would never have occurred. The Spanish conquest of Mexico set in process, set in chain, a series of events that lead us to the world we live in today. And in a way, the Chinese occupation and annihilation of Tibetan culture is just the latest episode in that continuing story. Now, it's complicated by the fact that the Aztecs, who are properly known as the Mexica, but I'll refer to them as the Aztecs here, were themselves, shall we say, a not very nice culture. The Aztecs had many dark and unpleasant aspects. It seems to me that as a culture they chose the dark side. And in a way, one can see Cortez and the Spaniards as a kind of instant karma for the choices that the Aztecs made. Because if the Aztecs had chosen to embrace their neighbors, if they had chosen to love their neighbors, if they had chosen to create a strong, united, harmonious culture in Central America, the Spanish conquest would have stood no chance whatsoever. Cortez won because the Aztecs were hated, and the Aztecs were hated because of the things that they did. But those amongst the Native American peoples who went over to the Spanish side, really, there were only a few of them who understood what that meant, and that Spain represented a greater annihilation of everything that was valuable and good in the culture of Central America than anything that the Aztecs had done, however bloody and hideous the Aztecs were. And so I will talk about the bloody and hideous nature of the Aztecs and of the Spanish as well. The Aztec Empire is here, in a very, very substantial empire in Mexico and neighboring countries, and it was focused on Tenochtitlan, which is modern Mexico City. It's hard to believe it, but Mexico City was the place that is now Mexico City was once a gigantic system of lakes, and Tenochtitlan, which forms the heart of modern Mexico City today, was an island in those lakes, approached by causeways, magnificent constructions, really amazing pieces of engineering, which kept the salt and the sweet part of the lake separate from one another. It was really extraordinary engineering and architectural work, and it caused the Spanish conquistadors some apprehension when they saw the scale of the architecture in Tenochtitlan. And the Aztecs were a military culture. Estimates vary. One cannot absolutely rely upon the figures given by the conquistadors themselves, but they speak of the Aztecs being able to put an army of 200,000 men in the field. And they trained and focused their lives upon war, and they made war upon neighboring peoples. And they had knights, they had eagle knights and jaguar knights and all the insignia of their animal. And they had a certain code of honor. In Aztec warfare, the objective was not to kill the enemy in the battle. The objective was to capture the enemy alive, to maim or damage the enemy, but not too badly, take them alive, and then kill them later. And this was the man who sat at the head of the edifice of fear that was Aztec society, and his name was Moctezuma, at the time of the Spanish conquest. The Aztecs were newcomers. They had been in the Valley of Mexico only for a little over 200 years. They had come in as impoverished nomads, but with a tremendously powerful warlike ethic. And they believed themselves to have been led by Huitzilopochtli, which means hummingbird at the left hand of the sun, their war god. And one by one they took over and destroyed the people who they found inhabiting that area and made them their vassals. They had a feudal system, and at the head of it all, the head of a huge secret police force, informers who reported on the activities of everybody. I mean, really, the Aztec state was a terrifying thing in many, many ways. There sat Moctezuma. And he himself would preside over the rituals of sacrifice, because human sacrifice was a key element of Aztec society. And it's said that when the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan was inaugurated, around about the year 1480, again, one must allow for exaggeration in the accounts, that 80,000 people were sacrificed, and that the queues of victims stretched back as much as a mile in 4 directions, as they were led in for sacrifice and ritual murder at the hands of the Aztecs. There's been quite a lot of attempts to whitewash Aztec behavior, to exonerate it, to say that it wasn't really that bad. But when you look at the indigenous art and the objects that the Aztecs left us, it's hard to avoid the feeling that there were those amongst the Aztecs who really took pleasure in this ritualized murder, this cutting out of the heart, and offering of the heart to Huitzilopochtli. When the victim was killed, he or she would be, the heart was removed, the body was then dismembered, the torso was taken away and fed to the animals in Moctezuma's zoo. The heads were spiked on skull racks in the Temple of Hummingbird, Huitzilopochtli, and the thigh meat and arms of the victims were eaten with chilies and beans, because the Aztecs were cannibals. And this is a representation. This is how the war god was seen. This kind of, we would see him as a demon, here feeding on the hearts of and buckets of blood being poured over him. So this was the society, a society that had been immersed in warfare for 200 years, that captured its victims alive, that cut out their hearts. This was the society that Cortes and 490 Spaniards set themselves against in the year 1519. Moctezuma himself was in regular communication with Huitzilopochtli. And that communication was mediated by psychedelic mushrooms. This is something I have great difficulty dealing with, because I am a big fan of psychedelics. I think psychedelics have a huge role to play in our society, and I think that they can be a tremendous instrument of healing. But like anything else, the choices that you make define the outcome that follows. And in the case of the Aztecs, the choices that were made with the visionary mushrooms, which they called teonanactil, which means the flesh of the gods, the choices that they made were choices for murder. And Moctezuma, and there are many accounts of Moctezuma communicating directly with, I call him Hummingbird, the name Huitzilopochtli is quite difficult to keep on pronouncing, with Hummingbird, and being given advice by Hummingbird on what to do, and often being told to kill people and bring in more victims, and Moctezuma would oblige. Was this simply a schizophrenic ruler, or is there some kind of demonic play going on with human beings? Is there some force at work in the universe that seeks to drive us to madness and cruelty and wicked behavior, when we can so easily make other choices? These are my central characters are two young Native American women, and I've got these images off Google Images, but one of them is a historical figure. Her name is Malinal. She's actually a key figure in the story of the Conquest. And the other is a young witch called Tozi. I call her Tozi. Tozi is a fictional character, but the Aztecs did have witches. And like witches in medieval Europe, they were persecuted by Aztec society. And they could easily find themselves being fattened for sacrifice. And that, in my story, is where my fictional character Tozi and the historical character Malinal meet, is in the fattening pen beneath the Great Pyramid, looking out on the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. Malinal is a real historical figure. She became the mistress of Cortes eventually, and the wife of the mother of Cortes's child. Although Cortes doesn't give her a lot of praise in his books, he does admit at one point that it was, aside from God himself, it was Malinal who gave me this conquest of Mexico. She enters history at a certain point, which I'll come to, but when she enters history, she already has a huge grudge against Moctezuma. It's very, very clear she can't stand the man. And she is going to use Cortes as her instrument to bring him down. And I was fascinated by that situation. What was it that drove Malinal to this? And that's one of the joys of writing novels rather than writing non-fiction, is that it was possible for me to give Malinal this motive that led her to be the avenging angel who brought down Moctezuma. And my two young heroines are indeed marched up to the top of the pyramid, but there's a strange intervention by the war god himself, who forces Moctezuma to free them, and they're released. Tozi stays in Mexico City to work supernatural harm against Moctezuma, and Malinal goes to the coast. And the reason that she goes to the coast, and this is where she does enter history, is the Spanish. The Spanish had been in Cuba and Hispaniola since 1492, as a matter of fact, since the time of Columbus. And they had been building up their forces there. And they were well aware of these lands, the mainlands of the Americas. But they didn't feel ready to take them on. But there had been sightings of the Spanish. Moctezuma was already aware that something odd was going on. Large ships had been seen. There had been a previous expedition which had landed in the Yucatan and fought a battle with the Maya. Moctezuma knew about all of this. and it was bothering him because there was a prophecy, and that prophecy was the prophecy of the return of Quetzalcoatl, which was said that who was called the feathered serpent, and it was said that he would return in the year one reed, and that he would overthrow a wicked king, and that he would reintroduce a religion of peace, in which there would no longer be any human sacrifice, and the only sacrifices would be of fruits and flowers. And it so happened that 1519, the year that the Spanish conquest began, was the year one reed in the Mexican calendar. So there was an expectation of this deity returning, and he was described in the ancient traditions as white-skinned and bearded. Were no gods of peace. They had done terrible acts of genocide in Cuba. They had utterly annihilated the indigenous Taino population. They actually fed people to dogs. And any resistance was punished with terrible burnings and hangings. I mean, they just were, if anything, 1,000 times worse in their cruelty than the Aztecs. And all of their acts were justified. Basically, this Pope, the Borgia Pope, had given the New World to Spain and Portugal. Everything west of a particular line of longitude would belong to Spain, and everything east of it would belong to Portugal. That's why they still speak Portuguese in Brazil today. And in 1513, just 6 years before the conquest, was promulgated the Requerimento, which was a document that the Spanish were to read to indigenous peoples who they encountered. And they were to read it to them either in Spanish, in Castilian, or in Latin. Unfortunately, of course, none of the indigenous people could understand what was being said to them. But basically, if you do not surrender, I certify to you that with the help of God we shall powerfully enter into your country and shall make war against you. We shall take you and your wives and your children and shall make slaves of them. And we shall take away your goods and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault. That was the pious nonsense that the Spanish read out in a language that nobody could understand before they turned upon them with superior warfare and military science. And of course, really, it was gold that was the motive for all of this, the lust and the hunger for gold that the Spanish felt. Some of my Spanish characters, Hernan Cortes himself, an intriguing man. It's been fascinating for me as a writer to get inside the head of Hernan Cortes, this Machiavellian player. Undoubtedly a man of great courage. One cannot take that away from him. This was a brave man. He put himself continuously in danger. He was savagely injured in several battles, came within inches of losing his life. You can't fault him on that. Pedro de Alvarado, his second in command, a handsome, beautiful psychopath, a ruthless killer, brilliant swordsman, unbelievably cruel, and deadly, deadly man. Diego de Velázquez, the governor of Cuba. There's an issue between him and Cortés. At a certain point, he's jailed Cortés because over an affair that Cortés had with a woman supposedly related to Velázquez. Velázquez wanted Cortés to marry her. Cortés disagreed. Velázquez put him in jail. Cortés agreed to marry her. He was released, but Cortés hated Velázquez after that. And he always intended to abscond with the expedition. Cut a long story short, Cortés did abscond with the expedition just before Velázquez relieved him of command. The expedition sailed. It was scattered by a storm, but eventually they arrived in Cozumel, really a short hop from Cuba. And in Cozumel, they made their first landing in February 1519. Some art illustrating that landing. They faced no resistance in Cozumel. But it's there that Cortés heard of this character. He heard from the Maya of Cozumel that there was somebody who looked like him, who'd been living in the mainland Yucatan for the last 11 years. And they even called him a Castilian. And Cortés immediately got it. This must be a shipwrecked Spaniard. If he's been living in the Yucatan for 11 years, he speaks the Mayan language. I want this man. And he got Aguilar. He became Cortés's first interpreter, because the first contacts were entirely with the Maya. And indeed, Geronimo de Aguilar was fluent in the Mayan language. And he sailed on with the Spanish fleet down to the Tabasco River, where Cortés had some business to conclude with the Maya, with the Chontal Maya. Now, one of the intriguing things to me, just as Moctezuma had a spiritual advisor in the form of Huitzilopochtli, Hummingbird, who he communicated with in visionary trances, so Cortés had a spiritual advisor who he construed to be St. Peter, his patron saint since his childhood, as a matter of fact. He felt that St. Peter had intervened to save him from a childhood illness. Cortés communicates with St. Peter in dreams. And basically the fictional conceit that I'm playing with is that the same demon who appears to Moctezuma as Hummingbird takes another disguise and appears to Cortés as St. Peter. This isn't St. Peter, it's a disguised demon who is leading Cortés astray. And in a way, the same demon is playing both Moctezuma and Cortés like puppets to multiply and maximize human misery in the Americas. And this begins at the town of Potonchan, where a previous Spanish expedition has been badly bruised by the Maya. And Cortés wants to take revenge for this and is urged on to do so by his spiritual advisor, the visionary St. Peter. And this is where the technology of the Spaniards begins to make itself felt, because they face a vastly superior force at Potonchan of 40,000 Maya warriors against 490 Spaniards who've arrived in 11 ships. The odds seem absolutely insurmountable. But the Spaniards have huge technical advantages. First and foremost, they have horses. They only have 16 heavy horse. But those 16 heavy horse are something that have never been seen before in the Americas. The horse has been extinct for 12,000 years in the Americas. European armies have had thousands of years of experience of dealing with cavalry charges. Maya, Aztecs have no idea what these things are. As a matter of fact, they think that the horses and the men mounted upon them are some kind of composite being, something like a centaur, a sort of supernatural creature, which is part deer. They thought they were deer, and part man. And the shock of a cavalry charge against the massed Mayan forces was absolutely devastating. Secondly, the horses and the men are covered in steel armor. Thirdly, the Spanish use dogs as weapons. They have 100 mastiffs, wolfhounds, mastiffs, lurchers. I mean, just huge animals that are trained to relish human flesh, and they are armed. Of course, they had dogs in the Americas. They had chihuahuas, and that's what they had. They had chihuahuas. They didn't even bark, and they were food animals. They were really for food. So they had no idea what these war dogs were. And the effect was that what should have been a total destruction of the Spanish was a complete rout of the Maya. And at the end of that rout, when the Maya surrendered, they gave gifts to Cortés. And amongst those gifts were 20 women, and this is where Malinal enters history. And it's where I bring her to in my story. She is one of the slaves who is given to Cortés by the Maya, because after escaping Tenochtitlan, she goes down to the coast and is taken by the Maya. And initially Cortés doesn't realize what a treasure he's been given in the form of Malinal. As a matter of fact, he gives her to one of his men, Puerto Carrero, as his bed slave. But when the Spanish first encountered the Aztecs at Cuetlaxtlan, that's when Malinal comes into her own, because Aguilar, the Spanish Mayan speaker, cannot speak a word to the Aztec ambassadors. But Malinal speaks both Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya. And when she sees the Spanish struggling, communicating with sign language with the Aztec ambassadors, she thrusts herself forward and makes clear that she speaks both languages and that she can communicate through Aguilar with Cortes and with the Aztecs. And she becomes the key figure from now on. And very rapidly, she learns Spanish, and she doesn't need Aguilar anymore. She edges him out, and within a few months, he's no longer a serious figure in this story. Malinal is speaking fluent Spanish and is translating directly for Cortes, and she becomes his lover. Cortes conveniently sends Puerto Carrero back to Spain with a message for the Spanish king and some treasure, and he takes over Malinal as his lover, and eventually she becomes the mother of their son, Martin Cortes, and there's a monument to the family in Mexico City to this day. Fascinating historical character, and much abused. She's a detested figure in Mexico. She is regarded as, I believe it's correct, that a Malinchist is a traitor. She's regarded as somebody who has betrayed her country, handed it over to another land. And that's the kind of image of Malinal that prevails today. There have been more romantic images in the past, but that's the sort of image of her that prevails today. Again, writing fiction, getting inside the heads of characters, I felt that she's a majestic and amazing woman, an incredible heroine, and I believe she was driven by good motives, by positive motives, to bring down this empire of terror. And I don't think she fully understood at the beginning that she was bringing in an even worse empire of terror in its place. And everywhere we see an image of Cortes, we see Malinal in the image, in the Aztec garden. We see, even in modern imagery, we see the glyph of speech in front of her, because she becomes the tongue of Cortes. And it's she who tells him, I believe, about the myth of Quetzalcoatl and of the white-skinned, bearded god who would come across the Eastern Ocean on a ship that moved by itself without paddles, wearing shining armor, armed with fire serpents, weapons that could dismember men at a distance, that produced clouds of smoke. In every way, Cortes fitted the myth of Quetzalcoatl. And in case anybody doubts that there was such a myth, these ancient images of definitely non-Native American peoples in Mexico bear out the fundamental origins of this myth, and it's the myth of the feathered serpent, and we find that imagery as far back as La Venta and the Olmec culture in Mexico. And the prophecy of the return of the feathered serpent in the year one reed, I believe, played a fundamental role in the success of Cortes. Once he understood, Cortes's great fear was that the faction amongst his men would return to Cuba, that his men would be afraid, that many of them, having got some treasure, wanted to give up, abandon the expedition, and go back to Cuba. Cortes solved that problem by destroying his entire fleet. I mean, that also is something you've got to admit takes guts. When you're dealing with 490 men against a huge empire, he actually sinks the fleet. He didn't burn it, he sank it. And the ships were then disassembled and used to build houses on the coast for a small Spanish colony that was established there. And then he led the march inland, and he told his men, you'll either conquer or die. There's no going back now. And off they went into the interior, and initially the journey went smoothly. And his great hope was that he would be able to recruit the Tlaxcalans who were here up in the mountains. He would be able to recruit the warlike Tlaxcalans as his allies, because the Tlaxcalans had been at war with the Aztecs for 200 years. And the Tlaxcalans, unlike other Native American peoples, had not bowed their head to the Aztec feudal power. And they had refused to submit. And they had fought a courageous war of independence for 2 centuries. And at the time of Cortes, their battle king was Xicotenca the Younger. And there's a statue of him in Tlaxcala to this day. This shows the kind of weapon that they used, which is called a macahuitl, which is a wooden paddle with obsidian blades. This was a Stone Age culture. Aztec was a Stone Age culture. They had no metal to speak of. Xicotenca had been involved in a bitter war with the Aztecs, who used his people as a farm for human sacrifices. And Cortes thought, if I can get the Tlaxcalans on my side, then, and they will join me, obviously, because I'm against Moctezuma as they are, then it'll be so much easier to conquer Moctezuma. But Xicotenca, for me, is one of the great characters of this story and one of the great heroes, because he saw what the Spanish conquest would mean. He understood perfectly well that the Spanish were not gods, and he understood that they were there to bring Moctezuma down. And it would have been very easy for him to join Cortes right away. But what he saw was the complete annihilation of Native American culture. He realized they wouldn't stop with the Aztecs, that everything would be destroyed, that the old world would be gone forever, and that something new and terrible would replace it. And for that reason, this man of principle, against the wishes of the elders of Tlaxcala, decided to fight Cortes. And he did fight him. And there was an intent, and I described this in volume 2 of my series of novels on this, there was an intense series of battles. And the Spanish were really within hours or days of giving up. The huge lobby of men was urging Cortes to just abandon the fight. There was one famous case in which a Tlaxcalan warrior actually beheaded a Spanish horse with a single blow of his wooden sword, and punctured the myth that these were supernatural creatures. But Cortes resorted to terrorism. He burnt whole villages. He threw men and women, Tlaxcalan men and women, into pits onto sharpened stakes, and fight as they could, the Tlaxcalans could not quite defeat him. And that's why the elders of Tlaxcala eventually forced Xicotenca to make peace with Cortes. And Xicotenca's father welcomed Cortes into the city of Tlaxcala, and Xicotenca the Younger was obliged to become a general in Cortes's army. Once he accepted that role, he held true to Cortes for the next couple of years. But it's a sad fact that at the very end of the story, when the final apocalypse was taking place at Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs were putting up their last desperate defense against the Spanish, that Xicotenca went to Cortes and he said, now you have to stop. You have to stop. You have made your point. You have defeated them. Don't drive them into the ground. Show some mercy. And Cortes said, no, I'm not going to show them any mercy. I will kill them to the last man. And Xicotenca took his own immediate core of men and walked out on Cortes. He said, I won't be part of this anymore. This is wrong, what you're doing. And Cortes sent a troop of horse after him, captured him, and hanged him. That was the sad end of Xicotenca. At any rate, from Tlaxcala, the Spanish went on to Cholula. And there they sent a terrible message to Moctezuma. And that massacre was the famous massacre at Cholula. And this pall of sadness still hangs over Cholula to this day. And there are images in the Museum of Cholula that showed what the Spanish did to their Cholulan captives, feeding them to dogs. All of this to terrorize Moctezuma, to tell him that was the fate that awaited him. So when Cortes arrived at the shores of Lake Texcoco, he came with the aura of a god wrapped around him. And he had already succeeded in psychologically dominating Moctezuma, and Moctezuma was ready to invite him into the city. Now, it's interesting, the first meeting of Moctezuma and Cortes, again we see Malinal in the traditional paintings that the Aztecs did of this. And the account that Sahagún gives of how Malinal looks Moctezuma straight in the eye is another one of those bits of history that really fascinated me, because nobody could look the Aztec emperor in the eye. It was death to look him in the eye, and let alone for a woman. But she just stared him down as she gave him Cortes's words. And he said to Cortez, okay, you can come into the city now. There were others amongst the Aztecs who were not so weak-kneed as Moctezuma. And the intention was that after the Spanish had entered the city, these bridges over the causeways would be lifted. The small Spanish force would be isolated inside the city of Tenochtitlan, and they would be massacred. The Aztecs would fall upon them. But Cortez forestalled this. And again, one has to recognize an act of extraordinary, risky daring. Within days of entering the city, he had taken Moctezuma hostage in his own palace. And Moctezuma acceded to that hostage-taking. He allowed himself orders to his followers not to harm Cortez. And for 6 months, Cortez was able to run the Aztec Empire through Moctezuma. And he might have pulled off a bloodless coup at that point, had it not been for the jealousy of his rival, the governor of Cuba, Velasquez, who had heard of Cortez's success, and who sent a Spanish force of 1,000 men to Veracruz, where the Spanish had built their first town, to attack Cortez, not to support him, but to attack him. Velasquez couldn't bear the thought that Cortez was succeeding. Cortez was forced to divide his army. He had about 400 men, slightly less than 400 men in Mexico City. He sent 300 down to the coast, left 100 in Mexico City guarding Moctezuma. The 300 he sent to the coast defeated Velasquez's army and absorbed them into Cortez's army. And then they marched back to Mexico City. But meanwhile, this man, Alvarado, the psychopath, had decided he loved conducting massacres, and he conducted a massacre in Mexico City. And that was the final straw for the Aztecs, and they rose against the Spanish. And by the time Cortez got back with his now much larger army to Tenochtitlan, there was a full-scale war going on in the heart of the city, and Alvarado and his 100 men were surrounded and besieged. And Guatemoc comes to the fore as a key Aztec player at this point. Desperate fighting continued for many days. Cortez did break the siege. He got into the city, but he could not withstand the massive Aztec force. Moctezuma was marched up onto the battlements to call for peace. He was killed by his own people. And then began the final rout of the Spanish in Tenochtitlan. And they were obliged to retreat across those broken causeways, having witnessed more than 50 of their own men and quite a number of their horses being sacrificed on the pyramid. And this is called I can't speak Spanish, but the Noche Triste, the sad night. Remember, Cortez's army, now enhanced by Velasquez's men, is well over 1,000. 600 of them die that night. The Aztecs command the lake from their canoes, and the Spanish are impeded by the fact that there are no bridges on the causeways. In the end, they end up marching over the bodies of the dead, which fill up the causeways. Only 400 Spaniards survived that night. And were it not for the fact that the Aztecs were so busy sacrificing captives, they could have wiped them all out. But the Spanish were able to get away. They went off to Tlaxcala, and there they were given sanctuary, and they licked their wounds. And this is when really the iron enters Cortez's soul, and he decides that he is going to destroy the Aztecs by any means. And with Tlaxcalan support, he marches round Lake Texcoco. He wipes out one by one all of the Aztec allies, and he's isolating the Aztecs in their island city, where they believe they're safe. How can he get to them in that city? But he's learned the lesson of the Noche Triste. He's learned that he must control the lake. And in order to control the lake, he needs boats. And so what he does up in the mountains of Tlaxcala is he builds a fleet of 13 brigantines. These are full-size ships that will carry 50 men. He tests them out on a lake in the mountains. They work. Then he dismantles them, and he has them carried by 8,000 bearers 100 miles over the mountains to the shores of Lake Texcoco. And They're reassembled there, and then the siege of Tenochtitlan begins. And they mount cannon on these brigantines, and they're firing cannon into the city. They've completely isolated the city. They've cut off the city's fresh water supplies. The lake is salt. And there's a huge smallpox epidemic. This is the other thing. Whether it was deliberately introduced, I believe it was. It would have happened anyway. There was no resistance to smallpox amongst the Native American population. And a terrible smallpox epidemic is raging in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs are suffering, starving, dying of thirst, and absolutely riddled with devastating smallpox epidemic. And that's when Cortez breaks into the city again. The final 2 days of fighting are absolutely horrendous. The Aztecs put up a brave but ultimately futile resistance, and in the end, Cortez has the field. There's beautiful Aztec poetry which speaks of this collapse of Aztec culture and of the city of Tenochtitlan, and how the shields of their young men could no longer protect them, and how their spears lie broken in the roads. And it seems to me, in a way, as though the demonic forces that played with these two men, we always have the choice as human beings. We don't have to be demonic, but both of them made the choice for violence and cruelty and mass murder. And that choice led to the terrible, terrible outcome, which is that the population of Mexico is reliably estimated at 30 million people in February 1519, and 50 years later it's 1 million people. 29 million people died as a result of this genocide. Introduced diseases being responsible for a very large part of that number. So it's truly an apocalyptic scenario from which the whole of the rest of the world's history arises. The whole epoch of colonialism, of slavery, as I said earlier, of the genocide of the Native American peoples, all of that followed on from the Spanish conquest of Mexico. It could have been so different. And what for me as a novelist, the challenge for me was to find the light in this darkness. And the light in this darkness, for me, comes from the ordinary, everyday characters whose eyes I tell the story through, who live through this time of darkness, and who represent, who show that there is a light in the human spirit, and that even in the darkest times, love is possible, and acts of graciousness and goodness and true courage can prevail and can redeem us somehow from the terrors and the horrors that we choose to inflict upon ourselves and upon one another. So that's my story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico. Thank you. And as I say, we're nearing the end of our trip. What a fantastic place to end it in. This beautiful Himalayan foothills, and I don't know, the charm of this place is something special. I think everybody's noticed it. You know, the monks with their cell phones. And there's a monk who looks like from the 14th century, sitting at a laptop in a coffee shop enjoying a cappuccino, and everybody's smiling, and they don't hassle you so much in the markets here. Things are it's just a very laid back, lovely atmosphere about this place. I think it's a fabulous place to end this trip. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Gregory and his team. Yeah. Because it is a formidable organizational feat to get together a large group like this and to steer us, through a series of 5 o'clock wake-up calls and to get us all to meals on times and in and out of hotels and all these incredible sights that we've seen.
And no one's got killed. And no one got killed.
And no one got killed. That's amazing.
Thank you, Graham. That's what we're showing us.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
It's been really a delight for me and Santa both to be here and to be part of this. I've seen many places that I haven't seen before, and I just, as I said at the beginning, India is old in culture. That's what's magical about India, that we're touching a culture which is still alive, and its roots go back thousands and thousands of years into the past, and it's just continued, and it's continued to develop and elaborate and change its monuments. Some of the monuments and structures we've seen have been relatively recent, some like Ellora and Ajanta, quite a bit older, but the culture itself just roots back into the deepest prehistory. And that's the privilege of traveling in India, is to contact that ancient culture directly in its modern manifestation. Anyway, it's been tremendous fun. So thank you all very much. I'm happy to take some questions if anybody wants to ask me any questions. Yeah.
Well, your graphics were fantastic.
Thank you, Google Images.
And it would be great if there was some way to have them as addendum in the book.
I know.
I read the book and I realized in printing that's pretty difficult.
Yeah,
But
and also the book you've read is just
space.
volume 1 of 3 volumes. The second volume is now finished, and is my editor sent me an email just before I came away on the trip saying he loves it, saying it's awesome, but also saying he has notes for me, which he always does. He's a really hands-on editor. Whenever I see that line in his email saying, your book is awesome, I have notes for you, my heart goes, because I know what those notes mean, which is probably they mean 4 or 5 weeks of very intense work on my part to tidy up the manuscript and bring, the great thing about an editor is as an author, you're very close to the story, and you don't see some things that an editor sees. So I'm going to be returning to Mark Booth's notes. So that's volume 2, and then volume 3 is going to follow in a year or so's time, and hopefully we'll complete the story. Yes, I would love to put graphics into it.
Maybe a graphic novel.
A graphic novel, yeah. That would be great. I had this dream perhaps that somebody might make a film of it, but I don't think that's ever going to happen. Spielberg apparently is making a film about the Conquest, and he has got absolutely the right guy to play Cortez, and that's Javier Bardem. Bardem is a perfect Cortez. He even looks like Cortez, and I know he'll do that Machiavellian character absolutely brilliantly. Apparently, Spielberg came across a 50-year-old script that was written in Hollywood 50 years ago and neglected and ignored, and he's looking to develop that into a film about the Conquest. I wish he'd noticed my novel. Incorporated in a bit, but who knows? Yeah, it would be lovely to have a more graphic form, maps. Some of the historical characters, images of them, all of that kind of thing. Maybe I'll find a way to do it if we do a 3-volume set later on, but include some graphics and images. Thanks for the thought, anyway. Yeah.
What about a follow-up to Tangled?
Okay. The albatross around my neck. The story of Entangled is quite simply this. I was published by Random House in the UK, and Mark Booth, who's now my present editor, was my editor at Random House. I've mentioned this story to a few people, but I'll just repeat it here. This is one of the things that authors go through. Mark commissioned Entangled, and when we sat down for our editorial meeting to go through Volume 1 of Entangled, he loved it. He had notes, but he loved it. And at the end of the meeting, he coughed nervously, and he said, "I've something to tell you, Graham. I'm sorry about this, but I'm leaving Random House." He'd asked for the meeting to be actually outside Random House at that time. We had it in my son's flat in London. And he said, "I'm leaving Random House," and I said, "Why?" And he said, "I can't stand them." He said, "I just can't bear them. They have no sense at all of the value of books as books. They just think of them as commodities. They're totally driven by sales and marketing. They have no interest in editorial whatsoever. And I'm sick of it, so I just can't bear it any longer. So I'm out of here. I'm going to another publisher, which is called Hodder and Stout. Well, I was too far down the road with Volume 1 at that point. It was already in production. Marked it up. It was ready to go. They were ready to typeset. There was nothing to be done. It had to stay with Random House. But he said, the new guy who's taking over, Oliver Johnson, is a man after my own heart, and he'll love your book and he'll give it care. I met Oliver Johnson. He was a lovely guy. He loved my book. He was going to give it care. 6 weeks later, he phoned me up. He said, Graham, I'm sorry to tell you this. I'm leaving Random House. I'm going to Hodder and Stoughton as well. And at that point, Entangled became an orphan within Random House. It was associated with a defecting faction of editors. And Random House are big enough to just ditch a book. And they did ditch it. They did less than nothing. They suppressed the book in many ways. And I thought about it long and hard. I decided I could not continue with them. I cancelled the contract for Volume 2. I repaid the advance that they had paid on Volume 2. And I killed it. And I decided that I would publish Volume 2 with Mark Booth. But that wasn't so easy as it seemed. All sorts of complications, the tensions with Random House. Random House are a big player in the publishing business. And what Mark and I decided was that we would do the War God series of novels first. It was something I'd always wanted to do anyway. We'd do those first, clear some air between us and Random House, and then bring out Volume 2 of Entangled after the War God series.
So it's out there.
It's out there. I've already written 100 pages, and I know exactly where the story is going, and there will be a victory of the light in that story. The uglies, the Neanderthals, will play a huge role in bringing down the demon Sulpa. And it's very dear to my heart. I want to get that story written, but I want to give it some air. I want to give it a chance, rather than bring it out with a publisher who just wants to kill it. So that's why I've had to go this long, circuitous route, and I've annoyed many people, but I'll get there.
I have patience.
Thank you. Thank you. It will happen. And there is some Hollywood interest in that too.
Great story.
It's being developed probably for a TV series. Whether it will ever actually happen or not, who knows? But hopefully it will. Good night. Good night. Any more questions or thoughts? Going.
How's the research going on to follow up to Fingerprints as far as traveling and sights to see and what's in Graham's head?
Yeah, very well. Very, very well. The big breakthrough for me is Indonesia and the whole story of Gunung Padang. We're going to be back for a further research trip in Indonesia, looking at many, many other megalithic sites around Indonesia and revisiting Gunung Padang. We're going to travel with Danny Hillman, who is the geologist who's worked on the Gunung Padang site. In addition to that, on that same trip, I'm doing a speaking tour in Australia, but we're going to take a week or 10 days aside from that to do research in Australia, where there's some very interesting needs to follow up. I've never written about Australia in previous books before. I'm intending to feature Sumer and Mesopotamia in a big way in this book, possibly Iran as well. I'm going to do a research trip in the United States, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest, looking at areas that were impacted by that comet disaster 12,980 years ago. So there's a lot of different threads pulling together in the story. All I have to do is write it, which I hope I'll succeed in doing. I'm supposed to deliver it at the end of December this year, but I think I'm going to be late, a wee bit late. Anyway, there we go. Thank you very much indeed. Very good.